Meeting, bienvenue au comité sénatorial permanent des affaires sociales des sciences.
Welcome to the meeting of the Standing Committee on Social Affairs, Science and Technology.
We're from Toronto, and I'm the chair of the committee, and I'd like the committee members to introduce themselves, and where'd they go? Yeah, start over to my right.
Okay, thank you. Judith Seidman from Montreal, Quebec, and deputy chair of the committee.
Diane Poitras, Nouveau-Brunswick, bienvenue.
Nancy Green-Rain from BC.
Fabian Mann, Newfoundland, Labrador.
Tony Dane, Ontario.
Ratna Omidvar, Ontario.
Chantal Petitclerc, Québec.
And today we have the third and final session with respect to Canada's post-war adoption mandate for unmarried mothers. And we have four witnesses in front of us who are going to present on this, and then we will ask them questions after their opening presentations. So we have from the United Church of Canada, the Reverend Dan Hayward. We have from Mouvement Retrouvailles, Caroline Fortin, who is President and Provincial Coordinator, and Diane Poitras, who was an adopted person, is a member of the Mouvement, and the Ontario Association of Children's Aid Societies, Mary Ballantyne, who's Chief Executive Officer. I'll take them in the order that they listed here, which means going from left to right, if that's okay with you, and start with 7-minute opening remarks from the Reverend Dan Hayward.
Well, thank you, et merci de m'avoir donné l'occasion de...
Thank you for the opportunity to appear today.
2010 and 2012, staff of the United Church of Canada were contacted by various individuals and organizations concerned with the experiences of women whose children had been placed for adoption, particularly those who had felt forced to do so during the period from 1940 to 1980. In 2013, the United Church established an adoption task group to further investigate these concerns. An external researcher was contracted to compile a history of these church-run maternity facilities. That report describes the experiences of 7 women who resided at these facilities during the 1960s and 1970s. They recounted stories of verbal and physical abuse, inadequate care, loneliness, and shame. One woman compared the facility to a jail. They described being told that they would not be capable of raising their child, and that adoption was the only option. They said that they were not informed of their rights. The United Church ran dedicated maternity facilities in Toronto, Burnaby, Winnipeg, and Montreal, and some other homes and mission facilities that provided a residence to pregnant women as part of their work. The majority of women who resided at these facilities were not married. Many were vulnerable. During the period between the end of World War II and 1980, most were pressured, coerced, one might even say forced, to place their children for adoption. The prevailing view from the 1940s to the 1970s was that adoption was best for all parties because it gave new life to a child who would otherwise be stigmatized as illegitimate, and gave the mother an opportunity to return to her family and community unaffected by the perceived misstep. As well, both our churches and our society have often pressured adults to become parents. Those who are not parents and those who are unable to become parents may be told, overtly or implicitly, that their family is incomplete. For some adults, the choice to adopt is shaped by this pressure, by a desire to form a nuclear family. Adoptive parents may believe that they will receive support and affirmation as parents that they might not otherwise experience. For some women, hearing these messages and being unable to have a child has led to questions about their role in church and society, and whether it could be God's will that they should not be a parent. Unmarried mothers have sometimes faced similar pressure. As I said, women living in United Church maternity facilities and other unmarried mothers after World War II were told that they were not capable of being a parent, or that their family was not suitable for a child. We celebrate that Canadian society now recognizes more diversity in families than it once did. Many kinds of families are now recognized and celebrated within society. Across Canada and throughout the world, some communities and families have been harmed by unethical practices of adoption. Both domestic and international adoption sometimes favors privileged adoptive parents above the wishes and dignity of biological parents and communities. An attitude of cultural superiority has guided many of the people and agencies involved in adoption. Affluent adoptive parents, it has often been assumed, will provide a better life for a child than biological parents living in poverty. Single parents, racialized parents, and parents living in poverty have often been pressured, coerced, or forced to place a child for adoption. In some communities, including some Indigenous communities in Canada, many children have been removed from a community through domestic or international adoption. In such cases, community members may be provided with incorrect information about adoption or otherwise pressured. The removal of children from a single community has profoundly harmful effects. Children have a unique vocation within their community, and caring for children gives meaning and purpose to the life of a community. The removal of children leads to a loss of identity, purpose, and dignity, and denies the community the unique gifts of the children. At worst, adoption can contribute to cultural genocide. Nor is adoption always in the best interests of a child. According to the United Nations Convention on the Rights of the Child, each child has, as far as possible, the right to know and be cared for by his or her parents. Moreover, in those states in which ethnic, religious, or linguistic minorities or persons of Indigenous origin exist, a child belonging to such a minority, or who is Indigenous, shall not be denied the right, in community with other members of his or her group, to enjoy his or her culture, to profess and practice his or her own religion, or to use his or her own language. Many children removed from their biological families through adoption have experienced a loss of identity and culture. Many of the adoptees who submitted stories to us reflected on the question of identity and belonging. Some described a search for their biological family as a quest to learn more about themselves. Some described adoption as a loss of identity, while others experienced belonging in their adoptive family. Many described their identity as complex and multi-layered. Some have also experienced abuse and neglect in institutions, foster homes, and adoptive homes. It is the responsibility of governments and child welfare agencies to ensure foster homes and adoptive homes provide suitable care to children and uphold their rights. Today, we have an opportunity to re-examine the role of families within our wider communities. Churches, in particular, have a role to play in encouraging families to support one another and to help the recovery of a sense of community. From Jesus, we learn about our responsibility to one another. We call on churches to care for families and to offer support to all parents, especially parents who are struggling. We encourage honesty and truth-telling. Keeping secrets or blocking access to information harms children, families, and communities. We believe forced or coerced adoption is unethical. We grieve with all those adopted children and families who have been harmed by unethical adoption, who have been denied access to the truth, who have been cut off from family and community due to adoption. We sincerely regret the role the Church has played in unethical adoption. Thank you. Merci.
Thank you very much, Reverend Hayward. Et maintenant, Mouvement Retrouvailles.
And now, Mouvement Retrouvailles. Caroline Fortin. Good morning. Thank you for having us here today. You have my brief. So there are some parts that are about Quebec legislation, which I won't discuss right now. Now, most Canadian provinces have modified their legislation on the confidentiality of adoption files, but they are not harmonized, and thus they are discriminatory. And you can see that on pages 3 to 5 in my brief. Parents of origin and their children given up for adoption did not choose adoption. Generally, they were forced to do so. Many mothers underwent psychological, emotional, and even physical torture and abuse to pay for their so-called sin. They had to undergo scornful looks, wounding words, and the judgment of the directors of the establishments which were hiding them. For many of them, the fact that they had to give birth in pain was a way for them to pay for their sins, supposedly. After the birth, the only choice that they had was to leave their child to the care of religious communities, priests, lawyers, organizations, which were not always trustworthy, which would claim to place the child in a good family, but sometimes did so in exchange for a sum of money. Imagine the turmoil for a mother to lose the being that she'd carried in her for 9 months. What courage they showed to give this part of themselves to someone else, and yet how could they live their life without knowing the fruit of their womb? These women had, in general, to keep the entire experience a secret, never speak of it again, and to leave their region so that they would not bring down shame on their family. These social secrets were managed by the government, religion, and society at the time. For those who were given up for adoption, we can imagine how this rupture in the attachment that caused by the separation with their mother affected their lives. And some people had and still have a very difficult time recovering from the harm caused by this. Who are they? Who was their mother? What was the story of their birth? What was the face of their mother like? And what is their family medical background? These are all questions that have to do with the right to their own identity for thousands of people, for millions of people. And although I mentioned mothers and the children given up for adoption, we shouldn't forget that these forced adoptions could also have a negative impact on all sorts of other people involved in the family. We believe that any human, adopted or not, has a right to their own identity. But in order to know their identity, people need to know that they are adopted. In my opinion, the Registrar of Civil Status in Quebec should be able to disclose this information as soon as the adopted person reaches majority and is no longer a child. Most provinces in Canada have modified their legislation regarding the confidentiality of adoption files and information disclosure, including birth certificates, baptism records, and so on, and adoption records. And in our opinion, the baptism certificate after adoption is a falsely legalized document which is created to suppress all traces of illegitimacy. In our opinion, no information disclosure veto should be accepted. And as for the contact veto, we believe that no one can force people to come into contact, but for this veto to be acceptable, people need to present excellent medical reasons or reasons of family bias and give information on their medical background. In an ideal world, no veto would be acceptable. It's very important to know one's blood relatives when the biological parent has deceased. In many cases, adopted children want to know their origins. Very often, their biological mothers wait till the last moment of their lives to reveal to their other children and other near and dear the existence of this adopted child. Whether born in a province, whether born in one or another province in Canada, we all have the same rights to our identity. We need to respect people's right to their identity and the truth. Many people use the internet, social media, and so on, including increasingly DNA databases to find their identity. The secrets won't be able to be kept forever. For decades, adoptions were forced, and mothers had no choice but to accede to the huge burden of religious, social, and government power. They were ostracized and ultimately branded with a scarlet letter. Why? Because they were bearing life in their womb outside the sacred bonds of marriage. This was a different time, but ultimately the harm that was done to these thousands or millions of Canadian women was irreparable, and they're still paying the price. Many of them not only had to abandon their children, but even were told that their child was stillborn. Many of them were never able to hold their child, and others don't even know whether it was a girl or a boy. Some of these women were pressured to sign consentment forms, or without being able to ultimately take such a decision given their age or their medical or psychological condition. And also, these consent forms did not mention the notion of confidentiality or their right to revoke their consent. These stigmatized women deserve for the truth to be known. At that time, the ultimate decision seemed to be made only by authority figures who considered that a single mother and her child were all signs of shame and weakness and impurity and needed to be punished. After all of these years of ignorance, we need to change this, and because, among other things, for medical reasons, given that genetic considerations can be very important when it comes to certain diseases. When some individuals are unable to get the best care because of a lack of genetic information, we need their medical files, and yet some of them are not reliable because of the lack of information. This is a fundamental right. Major mistakes were made, and we need to address these wrongs. In other countries where the files were made available publicly, no major negative consequences occurred. Why would it be any different in Canada? Knowing one's biological roots is a fundamental need of any human. The confidentiality of adoption files causes major difficulties with identification and removes the opportunity for these individuals to understand their true origins and the truth. The right to equality and dignity is a right for any human being. So in conclusion, an adopted individual is not familiar with the truth of his or her origins. We need to find a way to make the truth available for all of these without discrimination. The time for ignorance is over. Adopting a child is an intentional act, but giving up a child for adoption at the time was not at the time, and today is often not the case either. In both cases, the child should be the subject of an adoption and not the object. The rights of the child should be respected. Giving life to a child has always been a happy event, but unfortunately for many of these women, it ultimately turned out to be a major act of suffering and a deep wound that left them traumatized for the rest of their life. These actions that took place in the past should be the object of a national apology, given the level of sadness and despair which was unimaginable for someone who has not had to go through such a terrible experience. We believe that the time has come for all Canadians to understand that we have a right to identity and truth. We all must recognize the dignity of becoming a mother. Thank you. Thank you. And now Diane Poitras. Hello, thank you for your invitation. Today, I'm speaking to you from my heart, my orphan's heart. I am wearing around my neck the number that I was given, 6076, which I received the day after my birth at the Crèche de la Réparation orphanage, where I was baptized under the invented name of Jeanne d'Arc Blondin. I spent 139 days in this bleak orphanage where each instant seemed to last a century, especially when I was crying my eyes out from boredom and misery. I wanted to die. I was living in a state of grim solitude. One day, I smiled as charmingly as I could to two strangers who wanted to adopt a little girl. It was love at first sight. I was delighted to leave this atrocious prison where I could not find anywhere the tenderness I would have received from my biological mother. That day, I managed to escape from the very high and chilling risk of becoming a Duplessis orphan. When I was about 10 years old, I learned at school that I'd been adoption, but I wasn't able to get any more information on my adoption because all of the documents had disappeared. In 1991, I decided to make a request to find my biological family. I received a document called Social Biological Background. In that document, I learned for the first time, at the age of 43, I learned then that my birth mother came to Canada while pregnant after the war. She was of Polish nationality, and she came from a refugee camp in Germany. She was multilingual, charming, intelligent, and attractive. I went for advice to the consulate and the Polish associations. I was given the names of very competent individuals who could help me communicate with my mother in her language of origin. I had to meet with someone from the Center for Social Services, and I was treated in a rather cavalier fashion. I also met with another social worker who was very old-fashioned, a bit of a bigot and very distant, and she told me that she had already worked with mothers who had to abandon their child. She was a bureaucrat who worshipped at the altar of confidentiality. Without clearly saying so, she started subtly preparing me for a refusal. When I returned to my hotel, I felt a profound pain in my heart. I felt like my heart was about to explode from pain. I had already gone through an episode of facial paralysis 9 years before, and I didn't want it to happen again. Later, my Polish Anglophone mother was met with by that same Francophone social worker. And then the social worker telephoned me to talk about the meeting with my birth mother. She told me that your mother refused an abortion. She thought that you were dead. This was a huge shock for me, but my questions on the medical issue were ignored. My mother had seen photos of me at different stages of my life, but I never got to learn if I resembled her or if one of my children resembled someone from her family. What unimaginable cruelty. I feel like I've been thrown out of my family tree. Later, I received a refusal letter, and my Polish tears flowed abundantly. This entire process to find my mother was the most traumatic experience of my life. Then I went through an incredible level of red tape. According to the social biological document, my mother was 29 when I was born. And according to the document, if she was born in 1920, she would have died in 2004 at 84. And yet, that makes no sense if you consider that she was 29 when she had me. I've never been able to rectify this error and get the real date of her death. So I've never been able to find the place where my mother is entombed. As for the health status of adoptees, who takes care of this? One of my grandchildren is autistic and is 5 years old. And recently, a doctor told us that he has a neurological problem that could have to do with the inverse chromosome. I was asked if there were similar cases in my family. I gave the same answer that I've had to give all my life. All my life, I've had to say this. I don't know, because I'm adopted. It's impossible to get help from the Human Rights Commission because an adoptee is born from nothing, so we can't do anything for her. To be born out of nothingness and then spend all of your life living in a state of mystery and lies, that's what it means to be adopted in this way. My birth is my birth, not someone else's. And my parents of origin are mine. By virtue of heredity and the blood that flows in my veins, the mystery of my birth has lasted long enough. This lack of knowledge of my origins is a terrible violence done to my intelligence. I sincerely believe that the mother who gives life to her child always leaves a gentle memory in her child's mind. All my life, I've tried to know what my parents looked like. I've tried to imagine what they were like, but I don't have anything. I can try to imagine what they were like, but when I look at myself in the mirror, I cannot find any memory of my birth parents, and yet I feel their absence through my entire being. Whether my birth was a romantic or a tragic event, ultimately it is mine. In Canada, everyone deserves to be part of the same human symphony when they are born. Any birth needs to receive a true identity, dignity, human value, and not be an eternal mystery. So from the doors of the orphanage to the doors of the Senate chamber, my origins will always be a mystery. Here before you is the most orphaned of all the orphans of Quebec. Thank you for listening and for your humanity. adoptees are people too. Thank you.
Our fourth witness is from the Ontario Association of Children's Aid Societies, Mary Ballantyne, who's Chief Executive Officer.
Good morning. My name is Mary Ballantyne, and I'm the Chief Executive Officer at the Ontario Association of Children's Aid Societies, and I've been asked today to discuss the issue of post-war adoptions on children born to single mothers in Ontario, and I'm pleased to provide some information. I'm going to sound like a real bureaucrat after hearing the stories here today, but my intent is really not that. OACAS is a membership organization, and it represents 48 children's aid societies and Indigenous well-being societies in Ontario. And children's aid societies there have the exclusive legal responsibility to provide child protection services, including adoption services, to children and youth who are at risk or who have experienced abuse and neglect. They also help families who are seeking extra support and assistance. Adoption as we know it now differs from how it was practiced over the past 100 years. Public stigma towards unmarried mothers existed both before and following the creation of children's aid societies in Ontario. Communities were concerned for children living in what were seen as immoral circumstances, and these children were sometimes removed in order to save them from what was believed to be a life of poverty or stigma. In Ontario, as in the rest of Canada, many unmarried mothers relinquished their children for adoption under significant social pressure. The harsh judgment that unmarried mothers faced was due largely to society's belief that the women were unable to make good parenting decisions and maintain emotional stability. The stigma and shame of what was known as illegitimacy, along with the lack of community supports, prompted mothers who were often young to make desperate decisions. Many were placed in maternity homes, often run by faith-based organizations, and were not permitted to see their babies when they were born. Clearly, this would be a significant trauma for these women. Little support was provided to them, as it was believed that they were to be blamed for getting themselves into this predicament, and that the women and their babies would be better off with stable married couples with means caring for the children. Race was also a key factor. While black children were perceived as unadoptable due to attitudes towards racialized unmarried mothers, a white unmarried mother was a candidate for rehabilitation through adoption. Adoption practices have also had a significant negative impact on Indigenous children, families, and communities. Children's aid societies in Ontario have acknowledged, with an apology, the devastating effect and impact of the 60s scoop that has the remnants of these practices still in place today. Legislation and social systems regarding adoption were developed to respond to the public pressures and attitudes of the time. In 1921, Ontario passed its first such legislation, the Adoption Act. This regulated adoptions under the supervision of children's aid societies, making them responsible for supervising placements and ensuring adoptive homes were suitable. It allowed for the child's birth certificate to be legally altered and gave an adopted child the same rights as any biological child. In 1927, this act was further amended, sealing the records of those involved in the adoption process. This reflected their view at the time that public knowledge about an adoptive child's status would undermine their adjustment in their adoptive family, and was also seen to protect the children from the powerful stigma of illegitimacy. And having worked in the child welfare field for over 30 years, I do acknowledge that this was the case. And even today, there is still the view that it is not in the child's best interest sometimes to have access to their family's history. I don't agree with that. We are moving away from that, but I do acknowledge it is still there. Data provided by the OACAS by Origins Canada suggests that in Ontario between 1942 and 71, over 96,000 adoptions were completed of children born to unwed mothers. We haven't been able to validate this data, but do acknowledge the very large number. During the 1970s and 80s, the shame, judgment, and discrimination experienced by unwed mothers began to diminish, and the social acceptance of parenthood increased. Mothers were more frequently allowed to make informed decisions for themselves and their children, and children's aid societies provided support to single mothers when they decided to raise children on their own. There were many corresponding changes to the legislation during this time. In 1978, private adoption became regulated alternative to public adoption. Children's Aid Societies were permitted to provide adoption subsidy for children with special needs. The Adoption Disclosure Register was also established, and specific rights for birth parents were outlined. In 1982, the Charter of Rights and Freedoms prompted Children's Aid Societies to review adoption practices. So practices such as limiting the age, marital status, or sexual orientation for prospective adoptive parents were deemed discriminatory. In 1985, the Ontario Child and Family Services Act provided further private adoption regulations, including, for example, that appropriate counseling should be provided for both the relinquishing parent and those wishing to adopt. In 2012, the Ministry of Children and Youth Services provided additional policy direction and funding to support adoptions of older children and sibling groups through the implementation of targeted adoption subsidies. Attitudes, practice, and legislation regarding adoption disclosure have also changed over time. The secrecy surrounding adoption has been a controversial issue for adult adoptees, birth parents, and adoptive families. In May 2008, the proclamation of the Access to Adoption Records Act gave adopted adults, birth parents, more rights to information and privacy, permitting them to apply for identifying post-adoption birth information. Acknowledging, though, that this information is often scant and sometimes difficult to access. The importance of openness, retaining important positive and supportive connections post-adoption has also become better understood. In 2006, amendments were made to the Child and Family Services Act to allow for openness, whether written, verbal, or face-to-face, direct or indirect. Further amendments in 2011 obliged Children's Aid Societies to consider openness in every Crown Wardship matter. In 2018, the new legislation, a Child and Family Services Act, will further expand openness, requiring Children's Aid Societies to consider the development or maintenance of connections for First Nation, Métis, Inuit children in their bands or communities. In addition, the child welfare sector is on a journey to better understand how it can better support positive outcomes for various racial groups, including African Canadian children and youth in care. There's a One Vision, One Voice practice framework being implemented where racial, cultural, and religious matching with kin families and foster care placements and adoptions is being addressed. Today in Ontario, adoption is seen as one of a range of permanency options for Children's Aid Societies to consider when making decisions about the best setting for a child or youth. Other preferred adoptions include kin families and customary care. In 2016-17, Children's Aid Societies completed 775 adoptions, and over a third of these included openness orders. Child welfare tells us that between 2009 and 2017, the data tells us that number of children available for adoption has decreased. This is because the primary goal of the Children's Aid Society is to deliver services that focus on supporting families to keep their children living safely in their own homes or with extended family. In conclusion, we believe that while society and social systems such as Children's Aid Societies have progressed with their views, attitudes, and practices with respect to children and their families, we recognize that we are only on a point in the journey. We better recognize the impact of permanency and separating children from families and are pushing ourselves to find better alternatives. We do acknowledge that child welfare has negatively impacted children and families through its historical adoption practices. We are finding new ways to listen to the voices of those with lived experience. We are working in collaboration with community and government partners to continuously improve our work going forward, including adoption services in Ontario. And I'm happy to answer any questions about the role of Children's Aid Societies in adoption. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ms. Ballantyne, and thank you to all four of you who've provided a lot of good information with a lot of passion and emotion as well. I'll now ask the two deputy chairs of the committee to start with questions. Senator Seidman.
Thank you. And thank you all for being with us today. Over the last 3 days, we've heard your words from the heart, as you've said to us today. Mothers who were abused and coerced and denied, and babies who were taken from their mothers and never really knew why they were being given up. It was a dark period, and it's very challenging, I think, for us to comprehend why this happened, how it could possibly have happened. But I think now we really have to look at some action. So we're here hoping to make recommendations at the end of this study about what we can do to redress this terrible thing that happened. And yesterday we heard from the Australian Senate, who studied this issue. And there were three major themes in their report: apology, financial contributions, and support services, and of course as well as access to information. And I'd like to know what you say. So I know it's a big question, but if I could just hear from each of you one recommendation, one suggestion to us that you feel could be the most important thing that we could put forward in our report. And so we could start with, yeah.
With Reverend Diane Hayward. I'll go across in the same order as before.
Thank you.
Well, certainly a apology is something that I know that the members of the committee are looking at, and is an option for the Government of Canada receiving your report. Our denomination has considered that. We are now laying the groundwork for what we do in the future through a major report on theologies of adoption, which has just been adopted this year, and looks at a wide range of issues in adoption beyond the operation by the United Church of Maternity Homes in the post-war period. So that certainly an apology is a major step for both churches and government, and requires that groundwork to be in place.
Fortin?
Alors moi, je vais vous...
Ms. Fortin, I'll be replying in French. So, a national apology would be very important. Because many people have been affected by these forced adoptions. However, it's now 2018. There are a lot of people, single mothers at the time, who today have passed away and who won't be able to receive that apology. So it's important to make sure that they're addressed to everyone involved. Yes, the biological parents, but ultimately also their children, their family, the adopted individual. I think that would be something that's very important. But beyond the apologies, I think the important thing is to just recognize that everyone has a right to their identity. That's very important. So to unseal the adoption records and to pass on the information not only to the adopted individual but also to the biological parents. Now, in Quebec, legislation will enter into force in next June, and states that the opening of the files will only take place at the request of the adopted child to learn who their parents are. It can't take place in the opposite direction, but only at the request of the child. So, in our opinion, both parties should have a right to see any document. In my opinion, and in the opinion of our organization, I think that is the right of each of these individuals. Ms. Poitras, I agree with Caroline. I agree for the apology and also for making the documents public. I'm getting older. The clock is ticking. At this point, I want to see what's there. With the Charter of Rights and Freedoms, why are we not in it? I don't feel included. I don't feel like I'm part of the Charter of Rights and Freedoms. To not know who you are means that you're not free, in my opinion. I agree about the apology. We need to allow adoptees to see their files. And please, this is urgent. Very urgent. I want to be able to pass on to my children a legacy of truth to my children and my grandchildren. Yesterday, my grandson said, "Grandma, when you come back home, are you going to know your mother's name?" Those little kids don't know. He said, "Are you going to know your real mother's name?" In my opinion, I've had two mothers. The one I never knew, the mother that I never knew, I've never abandoned her in my heart. I've always loved her. This is urgent because in Quebec, I've fought for 25 years. In Quebec, I've brought this document to everyone. MNAs, journalists, politicians, everyone. But I get the sense that we're a subclass, or we're treated like second-class citizens. When you meet with someone at the consulate, we're treated like someone with no name, with no face. At my age, it makes you be treated in the most humiliating fashion. It's incredibly degrading.
Yeah, I think an apology is warranted, but I can only speak for Ontario, but I don't know that, because I think any apology needs to have action following it, and I don't think that in Ontario anyway, the system is ready for the action that would need to occur in that way. So my recommendation would be that if you're thinking about moving ahead with an apology, that the child welfare systems across the country would really need to be examining the role that they did play, and I don't believe that in Ontario anyway that really has not happened in a significant way. As you know, we've been doing a lot of looking at the role that we played in the lives of Indigenous children, families, and communities, but this whole group of particularly the young woman back, several decades ago, and the practices of those times. And I was just entering the system as some of those homes were closing, but it was very much a thing. So it was a thing, for sure. But we haven't examined it. So I would really encourage you having the child welfare systems examine their role and then look at the current practices. And as I talked about in Ontario, many of these practices have progressed over time, so there's openness and disclosure and that kind of thing. But have we done enough? Have we gone far enough in opening up the systems so that the secrecy and issues of identity are really being well enough addressed? And as I said, in Ontario, a third of the adoptions since the new legislation have come in now have openness attached to them. But what about the other 2/3? What's behind that not being there? And that would be an example in Ontario of where we might start.
Before I go to our next questioner, where did the money come from for these maternity homes? You've talked in your report here about the legislation in Ontario, and a considerable amount of money, I'm sure, came from the government of Ontario. I don't know where else it might have come from, but what about we've also heard that some money would have come from the federal government. Can you talk about where did the money come from for these maternity homes?
You know what? I could try to find that out, but I would be not. I can't give you the precise information, but I can imagine that part of it is the faith-based homes, I'm assuming, would have provided that through their infrastructure. Probably some of it came from children's aid societies getting their money from the provincial governments to have, to pay for the homes. And I also suspect that some families paid directly. Because some of these young women would have been coming from families with significant means, and so I suspect it was a combination of that. I don't know the role that the federal government would have paid, because the federal government has not really with the exception of in the Indigenous world, has not funded child welfare. That's mostly been a provincial initiative.
Okay, next I have Senatrice Petitclerc.
Merci, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'd like to thank our witnesses from the bottom of my heart, and I'd like to thank you for your generosity. I have a question on the healing process. We've heard about the historical context, the religious and cultural context of this whole experience, which of course doesn't excuse what happened. But what we've heard a lot over the last few days is that today, when many mothers and adoptees who have been through a traumatic experience, an abandonment, or in some cases 2 abandonments when they don't ultimately manage to meet again, what kind of support is being given here or not, specifically to help with this trauma? After what I've heard and what I've read, I have the impression that for all sorts of reasons, I get the impression that it's maybe not so much underestimated, but perhaps misunderstood the level of this trauma. So I'd like to know whether there is any support, and if so, what the quality of this support is, the psychological support and so on. And if not, is this important, and is this one of the recommendations we should make? Yes, and Ms. Fortin, Ms. Poitras. Well, when it comes to the forced adoptions of the past, there's very little support, which is offered except by organizations like ours or Parent Finders or Origin Canada and other organizations, which unfortunately are volunteer organizations. That can help people to meet others and so on. As Mouvement Retrouvailles, we don't have any psychological support that we can offer, specifically medical support. It's just that we can share the experience of others who are with us, adoptive parents, adopted children, biological parents. They can come together and talk about their experiences. Sometimes just being able to discuss what's happened with others, to see that you're not alone in these situations, that can help. But in some cases, that's all right. But in some particularly difficult cases, we're talking about people who need further help. And as far as I know, there's not much help at all on that level. In Quebec, there are youth centers that can take care of trying to find biological parents, and when that occurs, there's very little follow-up as to how it went. They say, well, all right, we found the biological family, and then we close the file and it's done. There's a little bit of preparation, but it's just not enough. Some mothers refuse to meet their child because they're not ready. They're not prepared. They're not given enough time to think about what answer they want to give to the request. These women have been living with secrecy their whole lives. They've never met anyone, no psychologist, no help, because it was a secret. They couldn't and didn't want to talk about it. And then they hear that there's been a request for a reunion, and in some cases, although in some cases it's done in a humane way, it gives time for either the mother or the adoptee to think about it and to absorb the information. But then in other cases, the mother gets a phone call, and that's the end of the process because she just responds reflexively and says, no, I'm not ready. And then in the file, well, they note down refusal, and that's the end. So that's a problem. That's a gap. And when we talk about past adoptions, well, of course, today it's different. It's a different dynamic. Adoptions don't happen for the same reasons at all. We can't use the same methods we use today for new adoptions that we might have used in the past. So there wasn't enough support and follow-up, and there still isn't today. As you said, you said it was perhaps underestimated, but I would say that it's definitely underestimated. Ms. Poitras, yes, indeed, there is no help. When I was 25, as soon as I got this document on my family and medical background, I signed up for the Retrouvailles movement. But what I can say personally is that I learned a lot from mothers who are looking for their children, who maybe have had a reunion refused, who tell their stories, and other adoptees who also share their files, their story. We talked about it. So I stayed in contact with those people. I learned a lot. It was an education for me. I've been very lucky in life. I have a great husband, great children, good career. I have everything going for me. I have love in my life, but I've read a lot. I've received a lot, and that's what saved me. Saying that I've seen a psychologist or so on, I'm not sure that necessarily therapists have been trained to deal with adoptees or biological mothers. I'm not saying that they can never help, but it seems that there's not enough support from that angle. And also in Quebec, we often treat adoption like it's something noble. It's treated in a very Disney-like kind of way, as though it's one big happy family, everyone's happy, you get married, you have children, you adopt, it's all great. But what we want has been forgotten. People treat it like it's normal that you don't know who your birth family is. People say, oh, well, it's not a big deal. So that's what I wanted to say. Mouvement Retrouvailles was a major source of inspiration for me. That way I didn't feel all alone and isolated, because very often when you look for something and you don't find it, you go home and you're all by yourself. Because once again, you've come up against a blank wall.
Yes, no.
I think the only thing that I would add is that even with the moving forward in legislation for disclosure and the services provided that way, it is often seen as a service that a discretionary service from the point of view of timeliness and that kind of thing. So, in the world of child protection, when you've got a worker who's making a decision about going out to look into a situation where a child is at significant risk, or providing the disclosure services to a family that's looking for some form of reunification, that isn't going to get the top priority. And of course, prioritization always comes down to resources. So I wouldn't say that there has been a lot of significant resource put into it, and I would concur that the supports afterwards are not well embedded into the system. The supports to help families with reunification, and noting that it can often take many months or even years for people to get to a place where they can feel ready and okay about moving it forward. It's kind of more treated as a one or two meeting kind of piece, and again, that is a resource and I would say priority related issue.
Colleagues, I'm sorry, Reverend Hayward, did you have something to add?
Well, just that when our adoption task group reported a number of years ago, they proposed that the church develop resources for use in liturgy to acknowledge the hurt and pain and the hope for healing in that is related to the separation of families through adoption, and encourage congregations to provide opportunities for mothers and others affected by adoptive practices to tell their stories. This can be a part of response to the trauma that may be associated with adoption, although, of course, as senators know, only 2/3 of Canadians are Christian, and the majority of Christian denominations have yet to grapple with the adoption issue. So, but it's a step in the right direction.
Thank you very much. Colleagues, given the size of the list I've got and the time that we've got, we could maybe go to 12 noon or a little bit thereafter. I'd like to invoke the one question rule at this point, but for second questions, if we can get to a second round, I'll put people down for that. So with that, Senator Bernard.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So I'm going to try to wrap my 3 questions into one. So part A, Ms. Ballantyne, you mentioned that black children were perceived as unadoptable. So I'm wondering what happened to those black children in need of families who were perceived as unadoptable. And I'm also wondering if any of you know about the Open Door Society in Montreal that used to place black children in adoption homes in the U.S. In that period between the 60s and the 70s, there were a lot of those adoptions. So I'm wondering what happened to those.
Yeah, I think many of the African Canadian black children that weren't able to be adopted would have stayed in the longer term foster care situation, which is, is a precarious place for the children to be over the course of their lifespan, because they never really do move themselves into a family. So certainly more of them would have stayed in that situation, and then those that were adopted most often would have been adopted into white homes, or culturally not relevant homes, and certainly we're learning lots and lots about the the impact of that on those children. But to be totally honest, having really dug into the impact of African Canadian children kind of during that period of time, and where would they have ended up, and we haven't really dug into that in as big a way as we should. Our focus right now has been just on the kids that are currently in the system, not placed in culturally relevant homes, and probably more often disproportionately served by the child welfare system, and trying to figure out what that is about and how we can have them be much better served within their own families and communities.
Can I ask a quick follow-up on that?
Well, if I do that, then I break the rule here, don't I? But you did have a question about the group in Montreal. No?
Sincèrement, ce n'est pas une...
Sincerely, this is not something that's really been developed in our organization. We were familiar with the black market babies in the 40s and 50s. And indeed, children were born white and black, were sold to rich Americans. And when it comes specifically to black children, I unfortunately can't answer that question, as I don't know.
All right, since you were so quick, get your quick...
So
quick.
Best practices. You mentioned that an apology without action wouldn't be very helpful. So what would be some best practices that could follow an apology?
Well, just very quickly off the off the top of my head, based on some of what we've been talking about, where people are wanting to come back and find their either adoptees coming back to find birth parents or birth parents wanting to find adoptees. What's the resourcing there? A much better acknowledgement, I think, of the pain and trauma that is involved with that. So really looking at those programs. And then I also think looking at adoption practices today, the openness, and what are we doing to move forward with that, and what as I said, in Ontario, the 2/3 of those adoptions. And a lot of that is still, I think, based very much in the thinking that children will be better off moving on in their life. And that is something that, it's a real rethink in the world of child welfare. So I think, really looking at that cultural shift in the way that we think about the needs of children and families.
Senator Green-Rain.
Thank you. My questions were, I think, covered by Senator Bernard. Thank you. But just to follow up, and you say only 1/3 of the adoptions in Ontario now include a commitment to openness. So that tells me that we really haven't even started to fix the problem. Mm-hmm. So would you agree that there needs to be promotion to mothers considering giving up their children to adoption of the necessity medically for openness, for the welfare of their child?
Yes. So a couple of pieces. First of all, most of the children coming forward for adoption now are not coming from, they're not infants. They're mostly children who have been in the child welfare system. They've been removed from their families because of issues of abuse and neglect in the family. So the situation of young children coming forward for adoption is different. Also the openness piece is that there's actually some sort of continued contact between the birth family and the child and the adoptive family over the course of that child's life. So, and that concept of openness is to be considered for every child that moves from Crown Wardship into adoption. But it doesn't. It's different than if people afterwards are wanting to come back for disclosure. So that is still very much the right of all of the children and families. But this very big shift in thinking about what is important for children when it comes to adoption, that actually having good connection to their roots and knowing those families, their birth families, is a really important piece. But what it does also do is it calls on adoptive parents to look at their role as adoptive parents differently, because that child that's coming to them really right from the start has two parents, two families, and how does that get incorporated into the life of that young person? It's a very large cultural shift, and as the fellow from the United Church was talking about, the concept of what makes a family now, we need, I think, a society to keep promoting that in a very different way, that society isn't, just a family that has a mom and a dad. And I think we've come a long way in some of those cases, but thinking about a child who actually is born from one family, raised by another, and they actually intersect with each other, and the supports needed for that, that's something that that hasn't yet been probably in society as well recognized as it might be. But I think hearing stories from those that have had this separation, those stories need to be more told so that people do work harder right from the get-go to have those kids have that connection.
Thank you.
Senator Poirier.
Thank you, Chair. I'm going to do like my colleague and try to add ABC in one question, so since I only have the one. Thank you all for being here and for your presentation. Merci à tout le monde d'être ici. My question is for Reverend Hayward. I guess I'm trying, from my understanding, what we've heard is these maternity homes, or the practice of the adoptions and taking the babies away from the mothers, was a three-part partnership. There was the religious organizations, there was the federal government, and in some cases the provincial. I'm wondering, in your point of view, was it like a one-third, 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 or was there in that one of these thirds that was the leader in it? And was the leader the churches, or was it the federal government? And to what level of funding did most of the level of funding for these homes, maternity homes, come from the religious organizations, or did they come from the federal government? And the last part of the question I would have is, are you aware of how many other churches have followed what you, the United Church of Canada, which I congratulate you on doing, come forward in working with these mothers and with the adoptees in an apology and offering counsel through the church? Are you aware of other churches that are doing that, or is it just the United Church of Canada at this point?
So our archival research, because none of the maternity facilities operated by the church are currently open, with the exception of the Victor Home in Toronto, is now the Massey Centre for Women, and is now completely different, offering counseling and work with girls and women. Did not break down funding. I can give you the example of the Victor Home, which began with the Methodist Church, which entered into the United Church of Canada in 1925. Their funding was originally was based on support from the governing church body, the Methodists, then the United Church, donations and income from commercial endeavors. So, for instance, the residents, while they were at the home, would sew aprons, which were sold to raise money for the home's operations. Later, there arrived not just support from the United Church and particularly women's organizations in the church, and private donations and bequests, but also per diem grants from the Ontario government. So our archival research was, for the report that we have, was largely to produce an outline of the maternity facilities and did not look at funding in detail, but that the archives are still there. Of course, they do date from an era when everything was done on paper, and it's based on how meticulous the directors and staff of the home were at documenting things, but is in the archives to be sussed out. So,
about other denominations?
Other religious organizations, have others come forward in actually following your suit in realizing that there was a wrong that was done at that time and that we should not be doing that, and are working with the women's towards an apology from the religious organizations or from your church like you have? We
have ourselves convened a number of ecumenical meetings of churches that have been involved in operating maternity facilities. For instance, not all Presbyterians entered the United Church in 1925, and there continue to be Presbyterian-run homes. But to my knowledge, none has made an apology or produced a major report on the theology underlying the Church's attitudes towards adoption, the way the United Church of Canada has.
Okay. I might add that other denominations were invited, other religious organizations, but they did not come. They declined to come, except we did get a written submission from the Salvation Army, which I think has been distributed. Okay, Senator Munson.
So Reverend Hayward, I'm a United Church minister's son. I was born in 1946. My father was in northern New Brunswick and then in Saint-Lambert, Quebec. And I'm just going through my mind at that time, as I was born, what kinds of attitudes were prevailing at that time. Because churches were powerful then in controlling people's lives, both the Catholic Church and Protestant churches. I'm thinking today what my father would be saying, or what he did, or what his attitude was like. Because the attitudes of the day were, it's like getting a spanking, although I never was spanked. This is for your own good. So to adopt a child, this is going to be for your own good, because the child is going to go to another family. And I don't want to get emotional about it, but I have a very close friend, I mean close, in New Brunswick, who this day still does not know who his mother is. And it's 2018. 2018. And I applaud the United Church, obviously. I have a vested interest in saying that. And you talk about ecumenical and talk about that sort of thing. But with attitudes having changed, and here we're at sitting here in this year, it's a long time. And as you can tell, being born in 46, I too am getting older, and I too am concerned about Madame Poitras, my Polish friends in Montreal, thinking about a few of my Polish friends. Why in the name of heaven, if I can use a word, can't the churches sit down together publicly and work something out in a more ecumenical, open way? And why has it taken so long to move to a simple apology? Life is more than an apology, Reverend. I just think that we should be ashamed of ourselves that we are even having this discussion and opening it up at this committee to say we are going to force or tell the government, please do this, and then you have a prime minister who gets up and says it. I just struggling for answers.
Yeah, thank you for your questions. Following on from my previous response, I would note that there were homes that the United Church operated in conjunction with other denominations or had significant funding or input from other denominations, such as, I believe it was Elizabeth House in Montreal, was a United Anglican Presbyterian operation. So yes, it's been a long time, but maybe not such a long time. I'm in pastoral ministry, and I have lots of folks I deal with every day who they're of an age where they could easily have been born in a United Church maternity facility in 1940 or even earlier. There are still people around, although, as we've heard, their numbers are getting smaller. I think our denomination has tried to be a leader on this issue. Of course, as I said, and as Mary Ballantyne has said, any apology needs to be preceded by groundwork so that we know what we are apologizing for and the parameters of what the historic activity was, and also needs an action plan so it does not end with an apology. Talking about the attitudes that prevailed at the time, and the church, I don't think, was much different than the popular attitude about unwed mothers, as they were called. Some of this comes from Christianity itself and what has been an historic dualism between body and spirit, where Christians have promoted a body-averse culture which has been suspicious of sexuality, and I'm sure that was your experience being a United Church preacher's kid, that sexuality was not something to be talked about or acknowledged, in particular women's sexuality. Pregnancy outside marriage in particular resulted in profound shame, affecting both the pregnant woman and her family. And the course of removing the shame was by placing children for adoption and removing the stigma from the child as they were removed from the community. And then the woman could return to her family, perhaps with all this having taken place in secret, far away from prying eyes, and the shame would be dispelled. That was the attitude of the time, and as we've said in our presentations today, that attitude prevailed in maternity facilities and hospitals and elsewhere until the likely the late 1970s, until mothers keeping their children was made much more of an option than it had been previously.
Okay. I've got Senator Ahmedvar, but before you ask your question, I've the list, we've caught up with time so that I can get other people down on the list. Senator Ahmedvar is the last one I have on the list.
So I take that as permission to ask.
Sure, we can relax it a little bit now. Okay, go ahead.
Yeah, sometimes it is. Thank you, Chair, and thank you to all of you for your testimony. We really appreciate that. I'm taken by your comment, Ms. Ballantyne, that apologies must be anchored
and founded in some action. Yesterday we heard from the Australian Senate study, a senator who presented their study. They had an apology in Australia, but the apology was the culmination of a national inquiry. And I'm wondering what your response, Ms. Fortin, Ms. Poitras, all of you would be to the notion of a national study or a national inquiry which would seek the truth on these questions and would be centered around the stories and the narratives of the experiences of adopted children and their mothers, but also examine the role of the federal government, the provincial governments, religious organizations, institutions, child welfare. And then, that was the Australian model. Can you comment on that?
Do you want
Sure.
me to comment on it? I think that I think there could be some merit in that, for sure. It is not it is not something that is in Ontario anyway, but I'm pretty sure I can say that it would be the same across the country. It is not something that is getting a lot of time and attention right now in the worlds of child welfare, and that's actually that's not a good thing. I think what is happening though is I think more and more the what has been thought to be really good systems that Canada has to care for those that it has deemed need care are really being questioned with kind of the fundamental worldview that has led us to behave in the way we've behaved over the last 100 years. And I think that worldview does come, there's a lot of Christianity tied up in that, and it's around saving people, it's around we can do better for less fortunate people. And I think that, when we think about some of the communities that we're hearing from, Indigenous communities now, communities of women who at that time were taken advantage of with that, we know better about what will be good for you, therefore we will sign, we will be pushing you to sign your child over. African Canadian communities for sure. So I think that that these kinds of inquiries into the institutions are good things in that they are really making us reflect, I think, as a society on what it is that drives us and therefore the programs that we put in place and how those programs are actually playing themselves out. So I think there is some merit in it. The one group of people, though, that I think we also need to consider, and that's the adoptive parents themselves, because I think, as I've been working in the Indigenous world around apology and that kind of thing, that many of the adoptive parents that were coming forward were also products of the time of, we need to, in order for us to kind of fulfill what is a societal norm, we need to have a family, and we're also thinking that we're doing a good thing for these children that maybe wouldn't have been able to have what they have. So I think that is another body that has been caught in this mix, and I don't know that it's necessarily good for them to leave all of these inquiries feeling that they have done wrong. Because I think they were also caught up. Provided they provided a loving home. Obviously, if they didn't, then that's a different story. But many of them did. Many of them came into it and have provided that. So, and I think their reticence to really support their adopted child to have contact with their own family, again, they haven't received the supports in order to really do that either. So it's just a body of people that I think also have been caught in this web and should be considered not as the perpetrators, but also as part of a system.
So I'd like to hear from the other three on the notion of a truth-seeking inquiry. You can't have reconciliation without truth, and I wonder if your
Ms. Poitras and Ms. Fortin, if the narrative that you have so powerfully shared with us has ever been documented in a meaningful way to be shared.
Well, I would say yes. I think, bon, je vais le faire en français. Ce que je pense.
What I think regarding the potential apology is that I think it could have a very beneficial effect on all of the provinces and would help them consider the situation in a more in-depth fashion. And especially for the mothers, that would enable them to step out of the shadows and finally get away from this environment of secrecy. For many of them, that's the situation. That secrecy is so deeply anchored in them. Many mothers have told us, well, when I die, I'm going directly to hell because I sinned. And that's deeply anchored in their soul ever since the adoption. That moment when they gave up their child to adoption. So I think that an apology would really help for these mothers. Now, with regard to the documents that have been published, but there again, we need to ensure that those individuals can comment or appear, because when we talk about the shadows, many people are still in the shadows and they've never wanted to speak about their experiences. So it's very hard to have clear statistics because it's simply something that has been shrouded in secrecy and still is. Does that answer your question? Or did I go away from your question a bit?
Bon, encore une fois, je suis d'accord avec Caroline.
Once again, I agree with Caroline. I wonder, how much time it would take, how many people would have to participate. In Quebec, would mothers decide to participate and step out of the shadows? Because there was propaganda to adopt children in churches and so on. There was publicity, but now there isn't. Not anymore. Those people who try to thrust these women into a situation of secrecy are no longer there to help them step out of that secrecy. Then I think there is also some solutions through the media. I agree about this idea of a study, but for example, nothing has been done to tell the stories of these mothers who gave up their children for adoption. We've shrouded them in secrecy and left it at that. We need more people to tell their stories in a public manner. Nothing has been done to tell these mothers about the importance of refusal, of reunion. Some mothers who have been through that have seen their lives practically destroyed. And when it comes to being familiar with one's medical background and history, doctors who participated in this process, because it was a trio of doctors, lawyers, and the church, well, these doctors are not there. They were there at the time because they made money out of it, but now they're not there to say, well, is there cancer in the family or this or that? When it comes to the associations, the Royal College of Physicians, the cancer associations, heart disease associations, for them, we don't even exist. So that's something I wanted to say. When it comes to participating in a study on some diseases, that's something that I haven't been able to do, some genetic tests, because I've been through health problems. Now, when it comes to adoptees' health, I think there should be some kind of campaign to raise awareness about this. And then the other thing, one of the senators said, for the love of heaven, but I would say for the love of adoptees.
Panelists on Senator Amavar's question? No? Okay. Colleagues, any other questions? No? Okay. Well, thank you very much. You have well informed us on this issue, and you've been most helpful from the different perspectives that you've brought, and we appreciate very much, and particularly those who've gone through the experience as either mothers or adoptees. We've heard from the two of you, and we've heard from others in this examination of the issue, and it's very heartfelt. I know the comments that are made, and they're received in that way. You want to say one other thing? Okay.
Oui, j'aimerais juste savoir si on peut.
I'd just like to know whether, after your 3 days of study on this, I'd like whether after listening to everything that's been said, it would be possible to come back to you with further comments. Is that possible to do subsequently?
Okay.
If you have something you want to add in writing, we invite any of our witnesses to submit further comments if they wish to the clerk of the committee, and then they can be distributed. We will go into discussion about how we're going to proceed on this, and with the idea of coming out with a report in a few weeks' time. But you haven't got a lot of time, but a little bit of time to get some input in.
Okay, merci.
Okay, well, thank you very much again to the witnesses. And committee, we still need to stay in session, but we'll go in camera to discuss the way forward with this particular issue in terms of instructions to our staff on the preparation of the report. So with that, I will suspend the meeting briefly, and then we'll continue in camera.